is authentic, and it is courageous. So be courageous and ask better questions. It helps us all better understand and interrogate the issues that face us to this day. So without further ado, I would love to start and kick things off with our first plenary session. And through the magic of technology, let us manifest Dr. Parag Khanna to speak about pandemic to endemic, the future state of the world. Parag, great to see you. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Yogi. Thank you for those inspiring words to kick off this discussion. Apologies that I can't be there in person, but it does look like a fantastic, intimate gathering. And congratulations on getting it all together after a couple of years of waiting. So indeed, without further ado, looking forward to this conversation. Let me kick off with a few remarks. So the topic, as you can see here, that we've selected is the shape of the future. Let me begin with a brief preamble to this. I'm old enough to remember the last 4 times, and I may be undercounting, last 4 times that people have proclaimed the death of globalization. The 9/11 terrorist attacks, people said, due to falling trust across boundaries and security issues, the cost of reinsurance and trade and so forth, globalization could never continue as it had before. I'm sure many of you remember that. Then came the financial crisis. Again, people were very quick to declare it the end of globalization. And indeed, it took a while for global financial flows to catch up to where they had been previously. Then, in 2016, we had both Brexit and Trump, the 3rd time in the last 20 years that people proclaimed the death of globalization. And now, of course, COVID. Many people, again, saying globalization has been torn apart. Look at the supply chain disruptions and so forth. Again, I think you see where I'm going with this. I'm a deep proponent, a long-term, if you will, supporter of globalization, analytically and normatively. Globalization is a more than 100,000-year story. It will outlast all of us. We should worry much less about whether or not globalization survives than our role in what is inexorably a global future. That said, the shape of that globalization is always changing in varying degrees, depending on geography, sectors, and so forth. And that's what I want to get into today. So rather than be a globalization minimalist or maximalist, let me give my views on where I see the next few years going in terms of the arc or the trend, the trajectory. And basically, the middle ground that I'm looking for and that I want to present to you today, at least in the first half of my comments, relate to looking at the regional level. The regional level is that middle ground that I think people have failed to properly identify and quantify. And I call this scenario continental drift, a world in which the major principal geographical and economic clusters, North America, Europe, and Asia, increasingly develop internal self-sufficiencies, some to some degree at the expense of globalization in certain dimensions, but in other ways not. The first thing to think about when we look at the post-COVID reaction and the global level is to compare it, as many people have, to the financial crisis of just over a decade ago. Then we saw that despite the disruptions to the world economy, there were genuine efforts across the global financial system and the governance of the international monetary system and treasuries around the world to rebuild global trade and to sort of restore globalization as it was. Whereas today we see something very different. And partially has convinced people that we are renationalizing in many ways. But what we see happening is a deepening of regional anchors, regional systems, if you will. So let me illustrate through the case of these 3 principal centers of the world economy. During the course of the last couple of years, what we saw happening is that many countries realized that with global trade networks disrupted, one needed to turn to one's neighbors more. You saw that happen in North America. the Trump administration was originally not in favor of extending the NAFTA agreement, and he denounced NAFTA throughout his entire sort of, political career. But he wound up signing the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. And during the time from when his tariffs began on China through COVID and the expansion of trade relations with Canada and Mexico, we actually reached a point where bilateral trade between US and Canada and US and Mexico both exceeded trade with China. Now, we've seen that tip back due to supply chain dependencies, import dependencies from China, but the trend is in the direction of regionalism in North America. I certainly think that's a good thing. There's a lot of course, trends in industrial production, in allocation of new investment, and of course the provision or the energy revolution in North America that's been proceeding or advancing for more than a decade, labor automation and so forth that are pushing in that direction as well. So I see North America continuing to discover itself at that continental scale. I call it here North American Union. That's a strong term. It's not something that we're ever actually politically going to necessarily achieve in a European-style supranational way, but I think that is a scenario that we need to see evolving. The other is in the middle column, the European Union. Again, Europe has, over the last 60, 70 years, tended to advance through crisis, to be pushed by crisis. Of course, we can see that to some degree with what's happening geopolitically, but prior to any reference to Russia and Ukraine, what we saw with COVID is a strong fiscal measures that had been resisted towards a certain degree of deepening and consolidation. A very large fiscal package, very long-term budget for the EU, and greater moves towards a sovereign bond market as well. In Asia, not many people appreciate that ever since the financial crisis of more than a decade ago, Asian countries have been pushing towards greater and greater regional integration despite their geopolitical tensions. And you can see that with the negotiations towards the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that went into effect technically just January of this year, which actually is the largest trade zone by volume in the entire world. And that's excluding India, which will eventually join as well. What we've seen in Asia over the last 15 years, actually, or more than 20 years, actually, since the Asian financial crisis and through the GFC and now COVID, is an acceleration of reforms as a means to offset global demand shock. Asians now have more than 60% of their trade internal to the region, which puts them only behind Europe. And that is something of a significant accomplishment, given that if we go back just 30 years to the immediate post-Cold War period, nothing of the sort was true. We thought of Asia rightly as still very dependent on exporting to developed economies, to Europe, to the United States. That's actually not true anymore. Again, Asia trades more within itself than it does with the rest of the world. Now, this is all, to make one final point about this regionalism and the role of COVID. We thought of COVID, again, as breaking down, if you will, our interconnections, our interdependence, and so on. But isn't it remarkable that at this point over this last couple of years, where the narrative that dominated our thinking was that walls and borders, protectionism, are all rising, the three of the most significant steps ever taken to deepen regional trade and economic dependencies and even diplomatic frameworks accelerated, right? The USMCA trade agreement, the EU fiscal compact, and the RCEP, right? So in the midst of this pandemic, three incredibly significant, forward-looking, progressive integration measures were taken in these three major areas. And I find it unfortunate that we have not heard people very clearly articulate that factual narrative of what COVID actually did. It clearly reinforced regionalism. To what extent it has undermined globalization, we can continue to debate, but it certainly has not meant an immediate retrenchment into nationalism. That's not what has actually happened, and we have very clear evidence of that. Now let's talk a bit more about the regional domain from a slightly different perspective that reinforces that picture. What you can see here is the world economy in purchasing power parity terms. Again, the largest bubble clusters, if you will, are quite clear. North America in orange, Europe here in beige, and Asia in orange. Now, PPP measurement matters more and more because of the fact that you have domestic consumption, production is a growing share of GDP. The local prices matter more. You have that trade integration I was talking about earlier, where particularly in Asia, you have a greater trend towards Asians producing goods and services at Asian prices, depending less and less on imports for that production, and paying Asian wages and charging Asian prices. So it's important that we start to think more and more in that way. And when you do, you see a pretty significant expansion in our measurement of Asian economies. This too is going to be reinforced by China's moves towards dual circulation with its largest trading partners and more broadly, which particularly is playing out in Asia and so forth. So again, this you see a very clear set of regional clusters. As I also point out here, some of the countries that we've traditionally thought of as belonging to or aspiring to be appendages or members, of the Western economic systems, things like Persian Gulf countries, Turkey, Russia. You can see that I've recoded them, recolored them into orange. They do trade, and certainly in the future will trade, speaking of course about Russia among others, more with Asian countries than with the West. Which brings me to another way of looking at regionalism, which is not only the geographical clusters, but also in terms of diplomatic and geopolitical alignments. Now, this is my kind of rendering or sketch of where I see the world going from a geopolitical standpoint. It's very hard to capture a world that still has hierarchies, but is not necessarily hierarchical at the global level. In other words, I don't put one single power at the center of this diagram, not the United States, not China, not anyone. Because as much as we do have a global system in which the United States, European Union, and China are in many ways the sort of three dominant poles of power in terms of their collective aggregate capabilities, it doesn't mean that any one of them per se can truly block others from having relations with each other and shaping those relations as they see fit. So there isn't really one single power at the system, even if nominally speaking, the United States still has more power than others, and China has more power in some ways than others as well. And also, when we think in terms of only nations, right, only the United States or only China, again, we fail to grasp the importance of how the regions reinforce that power and how stability within a region is so important for them to be able to also reach out internationally and build these other bridges and connections. The other thing that I wanted to depict here is that every region matters, every continent matters. So often we have geopolitical conversations where we'll debate endlessly who's number one, as if nothing else matters. But in what is truly a globalized marketplace, every region has a role to play in the global division of labor. South America matters in certain ways. West Asia, what many people call the Middle East, matters in many ways. Africa matters in many ways. And again, no one is able to block the ways in which relations are developing between Africa and Asia, Africa and Europe, South America and Asia, and so forth. And those are in many ways flourishing. There are South American countries that have joined the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. African countries now trade more with Asian powers than they do even with Europe. A radical shift of the pendulum from just the last couple of decades. So here you have this world of regional clusters, continents, if you will, each finding different ways to develop complementarities with each other. And I believe this is the permanent structure of the world, not a world in which you have a sequential progression of superpowers, Pax Britannica, Pax Americana, then China. That's not actually the way history is going to unfold. That's a very linear and temporary kind of projection. In a way, this is a return to the norm in which you actually have fluidity across the world and no one single power at the center. But you will have significant competition, right? Competition, and when we want to portray or project hierarchies in the world, we should think about it functionally, not in terms of the geography of one power or the other. We should say, well, when it comes to global security issues and military affairs, the United States still has a global capability that others do not have. When it comes to global infrastructure investment, China is clearly a leader and has a greater presence around the world than other powers do. When it comes to issues like environmental regulation, Europe asserts itself and attempts to be the global goods provider, if you will. And even within each of those areas, it isn't clear that one is necessarily in charge. We've just seen how China has gone and signed a defense agreement with the Solomon Islands. It has weapons sales and budding alliance relationships with countries across the Middle East and Africa. So we are competing in the functional domain rather than simply asserting this country is number one or that country is number one. And that's what I call, again, a geopolitical marketplace in which many powers can compete to be the utility provider for these areas, security, infrastructure, environment, but also, again, clean energy technology, governance and technical assistance, finance, of course, in terms of lending, credit facilities, currency arrangements, and so forth. And of course, technology as well, in which it's not just US technology versus Chinese technology, but actually many providers and competitors for technologies to different countries in the world. Now, you see at the bottom, I asked, can you spot the misplaced flag? I'm guessing you can all see what it is. It's the Russian flag there in the Europe bubble. I wonder if we should still consider Russia part of Europe. Now, again, in our traditional way of thinking, Cold War, post-Cold War, in fact, the Cold War was often referred to as the East-West conflict. And in many international organizations and many of your firms, Russia is treated as a part of Europe in terms of sort of corporate structure and allocation of resources and so on. But Russia geographically is an Asian country, and I think of Russia as North Asia. You've probably never heard Russia referred to as North Asia, but that's exactly how Asians think of Russia, and that's exactly what Russia is becoming as a result of the sanctions, and that really don't begin just with this present invasion of Ukraine. You can go back to 2014 with the seizure of Crimea and the sanctions on Russia then, when it began to accelerate its own tilt and pivot towards Asia. Pivot, of course, I'm using the Obama administration's term. And now what we're seeing is almost a repeat of the pattern from 2014, where Russia is committing to more pipeline development, more exports to China, will of course depend more on goods imported legally or illegally from China, from India, and elsewhere. So Russia is joining the Asian system, joining the Asian club. And in the future, the longer it's frozen out of, and even if it's not in the long term frozen out of, Europe diplomatically, it's going to continue to see Asian powers and Asian partners as its most reliable sort of trade partners and intermediaries. And I think that's inevitable, especially if the process of seeking to reduce dependence on Russia for energy imports retains its momentum in Europe, or builds upon the momentum, the political momentum that's now been generated. So we do have to start to think of, this map in particular, this map of the full breadth of Asia as including that North Asian component that is Russia. And this is a good point in time to look at the lines, the cross-cutting lines on this map, which are infrastructural. This is highways, railways, electricity grids, internet cables, even hydrological canals and pipelines and so forth. Many of these projects have been underway since before China's Belt and Road Initiative was announced 7 or 8 years ago, and are going to, in fact, continue to accelerate. Now, where you're sitting right now, we look at Belt and Road and we see it as something that's really cooled off. We see Chinese outward FDI into Belt and Road projects diminishing. We see sort of definitely a weakening appetite among countries to take on very significant debts to China for these projects, which is very, very legitimate. That said, if you actually look at China's strategy and China's capital allocation, Belt and Road may be less global today than it was 3 or 4 years ago, but it's certainly more Asian, because you can clearly see that it's committing more capital to West Asian projects, to Central Asia, and to Southeast Asia. And indeed, sitting from Beijing, its largest trading partner is Europe, which it still seeks very much to access. And of course, the railways that have now been suspended across Russia require alternative routes. So that puts a temporary additional stress on shipping. But China also, its second largest trading partner, has now become ASEAN, the Southeast Asian region. So just to be clear for everyone sitting here in the US as we are, China trades more with Southeast Asia than it does with the United States. And that's actually not the way we tend to see it from Washington. We tend to think that the US-China trade axis and relationship is not only the most strategic geopolitical relationship in the world, but that there is this deep and permanent mutual trade dependency in terms of the movement of goods and services. Not actually true from Beijing's point of view. So China is going to great lengths to nurture these alternative relationships that allow it to have greater resilience and greater proximity for the geography of its imports. And it's doing so by way of expanding its Belt and Road, its dual circulation policy, and of course the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Trade Agreement, all of which are going to, again, reinforce this Asianization of Asia and the development of these so-called new Silk Roads. So a final point about Asia before I move to some of the global dynamics again is just the demographics. And this is really the transition into looking at the shape of the future, not just from a geopolitical standpoint, an economic standpoint, but also a demographic one, because this is one of the really major inflection points that we are at right now. If the world population is reaching a plateau, as it is, that means that the majority of the world population that is already in Asia is actually more or less forever going to be the locus of the human population. And that's something that we have to bear in mind when we think about our economic strategies, because whether globalization is stronger or weaker, the fact is that for Western firms, for global firms, you do need to tap this significant customer base that represents the better part of the growth in the global middle class. So even if there are tensions with China or whatever the state of those tensions are, there are huge swaths of the Asian population. In fact, 2.5 billion people, including in South and Southeast Asia, from Pakistan through India to the ASEAN countries. That's 2.5 billion people. That's a much larger aggregate population, these emerging, ascending, what I call fourth wave Asian growth economies than China alone represents. And they're much younger societies than China as well. So Asia is much bigger than China, and Asia collectively still represents the demographic seat of the world. Now, I mentioned that we're moving into this, plateauing of the global population. I call that peak humanity. And this is very important in the COVID context as well, because indeed COVID represents another baby bust. The financial crisis was also a baby bust. Few people remember, we don't associate the GFC with the demographic implications, but they were actually significant in terms of the temporary, it proved to not be a temporary drop-off in fertility. Now, it's fairly unprecedented that within a decade of one baby bust, you get an even bigger baby bust. And the COVID baby bust is not only far more severe than the one that hit us with the GFC around the world, but it's also likely to be longer lasting. We not only have the tragic death toll of COVID itself, but we also have it compounding the fact that younger generations today have in any case been less inclined to have more than one child or to have any children at all. So as the collective impact of that is that the world population will reach this peak humanity plateau much, much faster than we would have predicted about 15 years ago, 20 years ago. Back then, demographic forecasts still said, or many, the consensus view was still that the world population could reach 12 billion, 13 billion people or more. Today, I will say, put my kind of viewpoint on the table, I don't think that the world population will even reach 10 billion people, which is still a lot of people, but it's quite frankly not a whole lot more than are alive right now. In fact, we are basically at the point where the maximum number of people that will ever live simultaneously are here, and we're seeing this rapid, sort of arrival at this peak humanity moment. Now, the world that we live in, the OECD countries, the wealthy, developed, mature economies, we are already at peak humanity, right? Absent immigration, the population of the United States, of Western European countries, and so forth, would already have peaked and is more or less, at a flat line. And I think that has significant implications for how we think about immigration policy in the future. One of the big turning points that we could see unfold in the coming years, perhaps even sooner rather than later, is actually a competition for young talent in the face of the demographic shortages and decline that we face. And I think this is really significant. So one more demographic point right here is that because of this COVID-related baby bust, it could well be that Generation Alpha, which is not yet fully born, it's over the next couple of years that we'll reach the 2025 point at which Generation Alpha is complete. Generation Alpha will probably wind up being smaller than Gen Z because of COVID. And that means that Gen Z will be the largest cohort, the largest generational cohort that ever existed, and we see the generations get smaller. But that said, if you add up the world's millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha, which is collectively the world's youth, you have about 5+ billion people. So that's still a very large number of people. Even though we talk about the world aging, we also have to think about the young people of the world and their future, because they do still represent the largest share of humanity. Not only that, because they're not having children, they're not only present in the world today, and the largest share of the world population today, they're also the future. So this is a bit of a sci-fi statement, but the present is the future. If your children aren't having children, then that means that the future is smaller than the present, right? So I'm not sure if everyone can quite digest that, but bottom line is the present is the future. So focus on the young and where the young go, because where young people go is basically going to determine the winners and losers in a depopulating world. You have a finite and even falling number of human beings, and you need a tax base, and you need entrepreneurs and caregivers and construction workers and innovators and everyone. Again, the tax base of a society, you need to be importing young people. So in opposition, in a way, to today's populism and xenophobia, I'm forecasting that countries will be engaged in a war for talent for young people. But to engage in that war for talent, you have to understand young people. And young people, they're not like you and me. I'm not a millennial, though. Sometimes I try to pretend I am one. But then I encounter my kids and I realize how differently they view the world. I've done a lot of thinking and research around the kind of psychology of shifting global demographics. And what I find is that we, all of you and myself, we use this first person plural, we use this plural pronoun we all the time as if we represent the views of everyone in a very confident, universal way. But the truth is that if you take the median human being in the world, if you line up the 8 billion people of the world, the median human being is not a married, two-income, two-child suburban household in a Western country. The median human being in the world is young, is unmarried, childless, is financially struggling, is a renter, not a homeowner, and is in the developing world. That's who we are today. That's not a forecast about tomorrow. So we need to have a lot more concern for what we're doing for these 5 billion young people who, those are their circumstances. That's us, and thinking about how we're going to make them more mobile, socially mobile and physically mobile, and how we're going to reshape our systems to cater to their values. And a lot of surveys show that the values that they most subscribe to are connectivity, sustainability, mobility. Those are their beliefs. Those are the things that they view as human rights. And I think they're right to hold those views, and we need to actually build systems that support those points of view. And therefore, winning that war for talent requires countries that offer opportunity, that offer skill building, work-life balance, and fairness in their political and economic systems. And that's what young people are striving for and looking for. And primarily, they live in cities, and we as a humanity have congregated in cities and are going to continue to move to cities. This is the map of the world population today, again, with all of us as pixels distributed across this map. Again, it's primarily Asian. There are 40 to 50 large megacity clusters. But what I want to show you is what happens when you take that human population and you layer in the final point that I want to just dwell on today, and that's climate change. So we've talked about geopolitics and economics. We've talked about demographics. Let's think about the climate impact on all of this. Because if you look at this map as I'm showing it to you right now, you have this layering in of what happens to the suitability of geography as temperatures rise towards 1.5, 2 degrees, and likely beyond 2 degrees Celsius. Now, this suitability change index maps out in red places that are becoming less livable for people, whereas green areas are becoming relatively more habitable than they were before. This is a pretty radical, stark picture. Now, it's also profoundly paradoxical and ironic and tragic, because as you can tell from the juxtaposition with the previous map, most of the world's population lives in red zones, whereas the green zones are the places where you are right now that are depopulating. And that is something that we have to think about, correcting. But there is no roadmap for that, not from the IPCC, not from any particular government, not from the United Nations. And one of the great challenges that lies ahead is thinking about how we take the young people of the world and enable their mobility towards productive areas, or invest at least in the kinds of climate adaptation measures that can help people or help geographies survive, adapt, and thrive. Thus far in our diplomatic discourse, again, the IPCC process, we focused very much on mitigation. Yourselves as companies focus on how do you decarbonize your supply chains, green your supply chains, invest in renewable energy. And I believe in all of those things, and those are huge priorities. But they get 95% of the total investments that are going into climate-related spending, whereas adaptation is being neglected. And adaptation is very, very central as well. That's what we do in the here and now. What do we do to climate-proof our geographies, disaster management, coastal protection, reducing the urban heat island effects, and even thinking about new geographies of settlement, new kinds of infrastructure that allow people to continue to be productive economic agents, to, again, adapt to climate effects, and even potentially think about larger scale resettlements of populations in light of the demographic shortages that we have and the climate stress on many countries in the world, developed and developing. But population resettlement is not something that you will hear about at the United Nations, because, of course, when sovereign governments get together, the first thing they talk about is not how can they open their borders to the movement of people. In fact, it's the last thing that they'll ever talk about or agree on. And so it's for all of us to think about what are we doing to empower the world's youth and make them more productive based upon the geographies of maximum future productivity. So I've done a lot of work looking geographically at the places in the world that I believe have not only the potential in terms of climate adaptation, but places where you see economic diversification, where you see a political openness to absorbing greater populations, a focus on being open to young people, and of course, cultural adaptability is crucial as well. And not every place that I've put a star around is doing anything of the sort. Canada certainly is, but not necessarily other places. But I'm thinking about the complexity of adaptation from the political, geographical, or climate, demographic, and economic, cultural standpoints, and looking to profile places and looking, and I think this is what yourselves as global companies can also do, how can you help places adapt themselves to absorb greater populations, to diversify their economies, to adapt to climate change, and square that circle at the same time, because again, we don't have a roadmap. Each of us has to make a contribution. But these will be, among others, the kinds of growing civilizational centers of the world if we manage to untangle this situation that we're in, where geopolitical tensions and climate change could spark mass movements of people. So my final point that I leave you with is just a set of scenarios. Because the truth is that when we're looking at the future, we don't actually know what outcome is going to occur, and therefore scenario planning becomes more and more important. So I've posited 4 scenarios about the world along the axes of greater or lesser sustainability and greater or lesser human mobility. And in a way, you can see elements of all of these 4 scenarios at play in the world today. Regional fortresses is sort of where we're at right now, in which we have very limited migration, but we have a growing emphasis on sustainability within our own wealthy geographies, such as North America and Europe. You can also see evidence of new Middle Ages and barbarians at the gate. You can see, in a way, a mad scramble among people to survive devastating climate effects, whether they're droughts or monsoon or tropical storms, hurricanes, that sort of thing. But also the fact that borders are still very rigid. Look at the US-Mexico border. Look at the Mediterranean Sea, for example. The final scenario in the upper right is the aspirational one that I've been describing in the last couple of slides. What can we do to optimize the human geography, the human capital that we have in the world today? Again, a plateauing, a declining world population that faces climate stress, in which you cannot simply squeeze economic growth out of pushing people into coastal megacities that are at climate risk, but have to come up with a new model, and that the very countries that are the most climate propitious actually need that jolt if you will, that steady importing of young labor in order to kind of maximize the world population as it is and as it will be. So the truth is, again, that all of these four scenarios are happening right now. And even 10, 20, 30 years from now, we'll be able to look at each continent of the world and see elements of each of these scenarios playing out. That's the thing about scenarios. In order for them to be realistic, they have to be anchored in today's reality and even be realistic and be visible around the world tomorrow. But what is incumbent upon us is to think about how we steer this ship collectively. And of course, I'm advocating for a very different model of how we think about mobility, connectivity, sustainability, and the intersection of those three as it relates to today's young population. That's not necessarily going to resolve all the geopolitical tensions in the world. We're going to see these scenarios where we have resource wars, scramble for resources. There could be water wars and all of these kinds of things. But there's also investments that we can make in adaptation today. In fact, we really do have all the tools at our disposal technologically to be more efficient with our water resources, to reduce the intensity of carbon emissions, to move towards more renewable energy, to do affordable housing, even mobile kinds of housing in many geographies of the world. We do have the solutions at our disposal. The question is, where will we deploy them, for whom will we deploy them, and how fast will we do it? And with that, I'd like to wrap up, and thank you again for having me join you, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Parag, that's a lot to unpack. So hang out right there. And folks, I'd like to introduce you to Tyler Goodspeed. And we're going to all kind of sit down, also to include all of you. So break out your app. The questions, we already did the exercise. This is where you're going to also be part of the conversation as well. So I highly encourage you to do so. These are some of the top minds in our space. So Parag really set the scene here for us. And Tyler, you know, the work that you do as an economic historian and with the perspective of, you know, where we are at the intersection globally. Let's start, Tyler, with you, okay? We heard from Parag, there's going to be winners and losers. In your view, who will they be and why?
Right. Well, when I think about a lot of the themes that Parag touched upon in his remarks, they all speak to me to what I see as the biggest macroeconomic phenomenon of the past 30 years, which was the deep integration into the global economy of what is now a $15 trillion non-market economy characterized by highly carbon-intensive production and an abundant supply of relatively cheap labor. And I think we are witnessing the conclusion of that paradigm. And when I think of the winners and losers from that conclusion, I think of who were the winners and losers from the establishment of that paradigm. So winners in the 2000s were commodity exporters to the People's Republic of China. Winners were advanced economy exporters to China, including, for example, Germany. Domestically in the United States, winners were financial asset prices and owners of capital. Losers were competitors to China, low-cost competitors to China. Losers were low-skilled labor and low-skilled labor in the advanced economy world. And another winner was consumers. So when I think about the winners and losers of a transition to a new paradigm, I think of the inverse of those winners and losers from the 2000s.
Parag, what do you think about that? The work that you do very much focuses on Asia as part of this shift. And in your view, what is the role that Asia plays, and who are the winners and losers in your opinion?
Well, we can talk about winners and losers within Asia as well as globally. Now, again, what we have seen unfold in the last, say, 10 years in particular, is that what I, again, described as the fourth wave Asian economies are really coming into their own. If we look at the supply chain shifts out of China, owing to actually pre-Trump era tensions or tariffs. What we saw is that already, because Chinese wages were rising, you started to see foreign investment move towards South and Southeast Asia. In fact, ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries alone, on the eve of the pandemic in 2019, had almost equaled China in terms of inbound FDI. Now that flipped again in 2020 because China, it sort of clamped down on COVID and so forth, but we'll probably see a normalization of that trend again because of the politics, and again, Chinese wages still being, of course, rising, its workforce shrinking, and so on. So Southeast Asia, South and Southeast Asia are political and demographic winners, if you will, in the future. Now, they're not as productive as China in terms of manufacturing output, but they're also trying to leapfrog, trying to move up the value chain. And they're actually depending on American and European and Japanese foreign investment to achieve that. So you can see that whether it's Samsung or whether it's Toyota or whether it's Siemens and so forth, there is an improvement in productivity and output in these poorer countries as a result of being very open to foreign investment. They also represent large domestic markets. So to be clear, it's not just the story of them being the next low-wage production center for the rest of the world, though they are also the factory floor or a new additional factory floor. But they're also huge population centers, as I said, 2.5 billion people across South and Southeast Asia. So we cannot look at the future of Asia solely as a Sino-centric play. Of course, China is first among equals, largest economy in the region, and again, on PPP terms globally. It's not just about Asia. And Tyler's absolutely right that countries that have been purely competing on the basis of wage will not necessarily be able to do so in the future either. But one of the reasons is, again, the technological automation, the labor automation. Remember, China is remaining productive in terms of its output, industrial output, and so on, even as its workforce declines, precisely because it's investing so incredibly heavily in automation, right? It's trying to catch up in the robot density category with Korea, with Germany, with Japan. So that's going to mean that irrespective of its population dynamics, it can actually still be a very, very robust production center. The question is, are other countries with shrinking labor forces going to catch up and do the same? Korea is certainly doing so, started to really accelerate that during COVID because of the way in which it hit their labor force. Europe is going to have to move a lot faster as well.
Tyler, you talk about, the end of a transition of what was. What is next? I mean, the future has already landed on us. Where is the value chain going globally for a lot of these countries, these emerging developing markets? And then in your view, how does this group of leaders incorporate that into their thinking as they not only look at domestic markets, but really the domestic market of the world from a consumer perspective?
Right, so certainly I think, as Parag pointed out, we are likely to see greater shift of global production to South and Southeast Asia, countries that I would describe as substitutes to China rather than complements to China. I would be cautious about what I hear to be a common refrain, a new thesis that we are globally moving from a just-in-time to just-in-case inventory management. More plausible, I think, is simply that in 2021, we saw a massive increase in demand, especially in the United States, but also in other advanced economies where they embarked on fiscal stimulus, bumping up against an impaired supply side. And that difference has to go somewhere, and it has to go into prices. And I think what we saw in 2021 was a lot of firms have been underprepared for that massive increase in demand. They then overbought in order to restock some of that inventory. And so I actually think that we've imported from the 1960s and 1970s not only inflation, but also the sort of shorter business cycles that characterized the 1960s and 1970s. So we have to be careful not to confuse the structural and the cyclical.
Anybody remember their last visit to Asia? Jakarta traffic, not good for productivity. That's all I have to say.
Yeah, and actually, in terms of trends, in terms of shifting production globally, one thing that I think is really interesting is to look at surveys of global CFOs on the eve of the COVID shock or just at the start of the COVID shock. Because in January 2020, the Bank of America conducted a survey of 3,000 firms with global supply chains, and of those firms, 80% reported that they were already considering moving or relocating some of their global supply chains. 3/4 of those reported that they planned to expand reshoring activity. And so this is before the pandemic. So that's driven by cost considerations in China. That's considering geopolitical considerations. That's considering trade tensions between the U.S. and China. Fast forward a few months, UBS conducted a survey of CFOs of major multinational enterprises with global production. And of North American firms with production in China, 76%, so this is early 2020, 76% reported that they plan to relocate some of their Chinese capacity to markets abroad. The most common destinations were actually the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Japan. Of North Asian firms with production operations in China, 85% reported that they plan to shift some of their production, with the most common destinations being reshoring to South Korea, Taiwan, or Japan, or else moving to South and Southeast Asia.
Playing that counter bet that if we're going to, be hit with massive supply chain inflation costs, that we might as well reshore and play that off of wages and labor and domestic policy. Parag?
Yes, but the middle ground really between these positions comes down to make where you sell, right? Because as I indicated earlier, no one wants to abandon Asian markets, whether you're looking at China or ex-China. So for example, in empirical data that we have now, a lot of companies that have said they're going to expand out of China have actually pursued a China plus strategy. They're still in China because they want to access the Chinese market. And even with RCEP coming into effect, they don't principally believe that they're going to produce in Southeast Asia and then export into China when they're already in China. So China has a stickiness, as we know, for Apple and for many other companies. Then when you look at electronics, apparel, automobile parts, and other sectors, you do find that to the extent that firms have actually exited China, again, it could be either a China plus one or an actual exit, the winners have primarily been in those sectors, which are very significant in terms of global supply chains. The winners have clearly been India, Vietnam, and Thailand. Now, on the nearshoring side, it's more a make where you sell story. Of course, it makes sense for the U.S. market to make, whether it's certain electronics, appliances, and so forth, especially if you're using cheap energy and if you're automating your production, it makes a lot of sense. But you're not going to now export iPhones and other sorts of things from the United States across the ocean to China, especially when the United States has not joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's not going to happen. So where does it all settle? It settles at make where you sell. Because it's not just because we don't live in a world of global free trade as such, per se. There isn't fully, normalization. There isn't progress in WTO future rounds. You have these regional trade agreements, but you also have the industrial policies that are incentivizing, in fact, demanding that one makes where one sells. Because what the developing world is learning, by which I principally mean now the new production centers of South and Southeast Asia, is that they're looking at the Chinese playbook. On the one hand, there's the Western playbook that says, of course, you want to reduce capital controls, you want to, open quickly to foreign investment, but the Chinese playbook has also taught them to pursue a pretty, strong industrial policy of demanding that there be technology transfer, hiring of local workers, helping to accelerate those local ecosystems. And that's precisely what is happening in India, in Vietnam, and elsewhere. So the bottom line is we're going to wind up in a make where you sell world, and I think that companies should plan accordingly.
Companies should plan accordingly, and also from a policy point of view, countries also have to observe what the changing conditions are on the ground and support. Question from the audience. Tim asks, given the humanity curve, is the present labor supply shortage the future? A lot packed into that question. Tyler.
Right, so certainly we experienced for the better part of 3 decades the impact of, as I said, put it, the deep integration of a 1 billion plus population into the global economy. And not only was that an introduction of relatively low-cost labor, it was also the introduction and integration to the global economy of an abundant supply of savings as that population aged and prepared for longer lives in retirement without a social safety net. And I think one thing that we're looking at in the coming years is those peak cohorts of Chinese and other emerging market and advanced economy populations, those peak cohorts of population entering retirement age. Now in Japan and Germany to a certain extent, where they have robust social safety nets, particularly for pensioners, we didn't see much dissaving, but I think with countries like China, these population cohorts are going to be entering their peak dissaving years. So whereas for most of the past 20, 30 years, there was a deflationary impulse coming from China owing to demographics, moving forward, I think increasingly we could be seeing a deflationary impulse emanating from these demographic shifts. And yes, in terms of the shortfall, labor shortfall, even within advanced economies, just look at the United States over the past 2 years, where trends that were already underway were accelerated. So the peak year for the baby boom generation was 1957. Those folks turned 62 in 2019. 62 happens to be a pretty critical year for retirements. And then now these are big cohorts that are continuing to enter retirement age. And over the past 2 years, by my estimates, about 1.5 million Americans took early retirement. And one thing that we see it in survey data, we see it in ANEC data, is that 35-year-olds just aren't perfect substitutes for highly experienced 62-year-olds. They're just not.
It's the transference of experience, really, that we all have a responsibility to. I'll share an observation in our reporting in 2019. Went to China, talked about the blockchain revolution there. Wanted to understand the labor constriction, because developers, I don't know if you're trying to hire tech people, there are constraints. And I asked one, as a developer getting into the workforce, is it exciting to join an Alibaba or a Tencent or a Baidu, all the top technology companies in China? And he said, you know what? My friends and I say no. Why work 996, 9 to 9, 6 days a week, when we can build our own ideas? And the adjacentness to the hockey stick of value, rather than being part of a big blob called a technology company. That was an active choice pre-pandemic. What is the reality of the labor force, not only in America, when you talk about that, the great resignations that we're seeing around the globe, really, the laying down culture, Parag, as you saw even in China, like, peace out, I'm good.
Right.
Where is this all taking us? And what do we need to do as corporate leaders, leading our firms and trying to inspire the next generation to follow a common goal or vision?
These are great questions. Just notice one thing, that there's a bit of a disconnect between what Tyler rightly pointed out, which is the large segment of the Chinese population and Western populations that are aging, retiring, and therefore that savings glut is no longer necessarily going to help in terms of that deflationary impact that it had, while also pushing up asset values in the world economy. That's the one thing. On the other hand, Andrew, you're talking about the young people who are saying, peace out, I don't want to work with 996. How can both of those be true at the same time when you're talking about a country like China? Well, the reason they can both be true at the same time is because China is both old and young. And when we look at China, we only see the old in our mainstream conversation. Let's remember that below its own median age, China has 700 million people. Now, even though its median age is not 35, it's in the low 40s, the fact is that China has more young people today, right now, in its borders than the entire European Union has people. So we can't just discount China as just an aging society when it also has this huge mass of young people who are still huge consumers, of course. They're a gigantic middle class. They are still active, obviously, professionally. They're still defining and reshaping entire industries, both domestically and globally. And they also are a talent pool in terms of the geography of labor that I also want to talk about, that are not fanning out as much as they were before, but they have a significant impact. You can see it in Singapore, you can see it elsewhere, where Chinese firms are very much internationalizing, globalizing, and finding ways to, again, re-domicile themselves as non-mainland companies in order to circumvent the growing scrutiny and restrictions and so forth. Now, a word on this young demographic of labor that I was emphasizing earlier. It's much more Indian than Chinese, because India's median age is a decade younger than China's median age. And already today, right now, in the OECD countries, which are of course the desirable destinations for high-wage employment and solid quality of life where people want to become citizens and live out their years and raise their families, right now there's more than 1 million more Indians than Chinese. That gap is going to grow by this much in the coming decade. So, because Indians are more likely to want to emigrate from China than Chinese are. They already have, very clearly. If you look at relocation data, which you can get from the United Nations for every single year, the country with by far, and I mean by far, the largest number of net annual outflow of people, probably likely never to return, is India, right? I mean, by a huge amount. And so, and of course, again, it being so young and training people in IT and medicine, nursing, if you think about the areas of demand in our economy, and we are services economies, let's bear in mind. So that means that not only technology, which is perhaps initially dependent on a large labor force, but then decreasingly dependent. Right now, in terms of the services economy of education, of healthcare, of hospitality, of again, medical professions, all of that still depends on human beings. We need to import people, including those younger Asian populations. They're primarily going to come from South Asia, not from East Asia. And therefore, again, you're going to see this war for young talent in the services sector to bring in those people. And I think that's where there is still a large pool of young people, and they do have those values, right? As you mentioned, I mentioned earlier, they're seeking certain guarantees in terms of quality of life, pathways to citizenship, a work-life balance, welfare system, sustainability, of course, welcoming culture to foreigners. And it's along those verticals that the competition is going to play out. Canada, again, is really very much in the lead in that domain. The UK, despite Brexit, is actually changing its immigration policy in a more rather than less progressive direction. I'm not sure how many people are paying attention to this, but they've been the beneficiaries partially of America's very opaque and complex and onerous immigration policy and the Trump effect and so on. But the bottom line is there is this war for talent. You're seeing countries issuing these nomad visas that are saying no visa required, come one, come all, stay as long as you like, and that sort of thing. And again, this is one of these things that happened during COVID that's very counterintuitive. On the eve of COVID, 2 countries had so-called nomad visa or golden visa, policies for young, sort of skilled workers. Today, about 80 countries have them, and that's despite COVID. It's actually because of COVID, because they realized that when COVID struck and borders were closed, suddenly they weren't getting that flow of travel and tourism, business conferences, hospitality industry drying up, and they realized, my God, we need people. And I think COVID was a wake-up call that says, we need people, we need young people. How are we going to change our business, our economic models to attract those young people?
I had one of those golden visas in Taiwan, and this was during the height of COVID. Half of Silicon Valley was there. Half of Silicon Valley was there in Taiwan, and it really sparked an incredible community where the government and the newly arrived technology brilliant community, they started interacting. Very interesting things happening. Somebody's brain drain is somebody else's pursuit of opportunity. So where do we find ourselves? And in terms of policy, you heard from Parag, in terms of policy, it could be corporate policy, it could be domestic policy, how do we lean into what we need to be to not create an environment where people want to leave, but to attract those who desire opportunity?
Right, so I think that there's an important distinction between levels and rates of change. So there's no doubt that in China there are still 700 million people under a certain age. Just as in the United States, we still have a large population of young workers, and actually that population of prime age workers between the ages of 25 and 54 continues to grow. But the question is, even as the level remains high, what is the rate of change and the implications of the rates of change for productivity growth? And so ultimately there are three sources of productivity growth. One, more capital services per hour worked. Two, increased skill per worker. Three, technological or other efficiency gains. And historically, the increased capital services, that was about 30 to 40% of productivity growth in the United States. Labor composition, changes in labor composition was about 10 to 20%. It was actually more in the past 10, 20 years as the baby boom generation reached their sort of peak productivity years. And then the remainder was technology and efficiency. So we've had a big dearth of investment. By my estimates, we've had a cumulative shortfall in business investment in the United States since the pandemic began relative to pre-pandemic trend of $1.8 trillion.
Wow.
That's going to lower the potential output of the US economy by about 1%. We had 1.5 million early retirements, as I said, so we're not going to get a big contribution to labor productivity growth from existing changes in labor composition. So we're going to have to be leaning an awful lot on technology and efficiency gains, unless with, I would say, good tax policy, we can incentivize a lot of near retirement and retirement age workers who are on the fence between retirement and not. If we can incentivize them to remain in the labor force, because one thing we know about good tax policy is that older workers tend to be much more responsive to changes in marginal personal income tax rates. So that's one, just domestically. And then I think the second policy possibility would be to start to move away from a family-based migration system to a more skills-based migration system in the United States, which would bring us more into closer alignment with a lot of other advanced economies, including, for example, Canada and Australia.
Yeah, hear you. Question from the audience from Kirsty. Can the U.S. navigate the energy transition at a pace if the regional paradigm takes over and there is less access to Asian supply chains? Can we? Russia is also a big stress point. Asia, supply chain in our face right now. Can America navigate properly? If so, what does it need to do?
Well, I think we can, but a really important component of that navigation has to be domestic energy production that includes relatively low emission shale gas production. So from the start of the shale revolution in the mid-2000s through 2017, the decreased cost of energy in the United States due to the shale revolution was saving the average American household about $2,500 per year. And that actually constitutes a bigger share of disposable personal income for folks at the lower end of the income distribution. And what's fascinating is that not only did the United States during this period reduce its greenhouse gas and carbon emissions and fine particulate matter emissions by more than the European Union over the same period, we also, due to the shale revolution, decreased our greenhouse gas emissions and carbon emissions by more than was predicted in 2012 by the Environmental Protection Agency for the Clean Power Plan. So I think that has to be a part of any transition. And unfortunately, one thing that we observed last year was that historically, there was a very close correlation between the price of West Texas Intermediate crude and oil rig counts in the United States. That relationship broke down in 2021. Why wouldn't it have when we were raising the regulatory costs for domestic energy production? We were threatening to do more of that in the future, and we were imposing a lot more restrictions on energy production. They had a labor shortage. So I think that's why that relationship broke down in 2021. It's starting to return simply because the price pressures are such. But yes, we can navigate this, but domestic energy production, including gas, has to be part of that transition.
It also speaks to the emerging bifurcation of energy demand and also global costs. And a question from the audience, rather than Russia joining Asia, is it not more likely than Russia and China will become their own separate and isolated region? Parag, what do you think?
Sure, I'll take on a couple of these points. One is just to reinforce and agree with Tyler's point around the American and North American energy potential for self-sufficiency, certainly on the back of the shale revolution, but also, of course, progress being made in renewables. And if on top of the investments that he's advocating, grid modernization, were a key pillar, of course, of the infrastructure investment that is eventually going to get deployed in the U.S., I think that we can certainly meet energy demands, with a lot more confidence. To say nothing, of course, of greater cooperation with Canada. Even without the XL pipeline, there's a lot of potential projects underway with hydroelectric and high voltage energy transmission lines and these kinds of things. So I'm fairly confident that we'll square that circle. If any region of the world, if any continent in the world can, it's actually North America. So that's one point about which we should have confidence, but we should actually just get it done. It's really quite straightforward. I think Tyler is exactly right in pointing out key elements of that roadmap. Now, on the geopolitical question, again, one of the things I mentioned earlier was that seen from Beijing, its largest trading partners are proximate to itself, not the United States. So across Eurasia to the European Union and to the south to Southeast Asia, with a rapidly growing set of relationships in Central Asia and beyond that to the West Asian countries, the Middle Eastern countries, the Gulf countries. So, it's very difficult to simply point to China and Russia as some kind of isolated bloc. It may seem that way from an ideological standpoint, but in truth, we're looking, of course, at India's relationship with Russia and their talk of a ruble-rupee energy trade, which is very important for a country like India, which clearly, next to China, has not been overly critical of Russia's actions. And all of this could have well been predicted simply by looking at India's economics. And if you rank countries, if you rank emerging markets by the current account, by the expansion of their current account deficit, sort of inflated by the rising cost of commodities, India may rank number one. You're talking about a country that's very price sensitive, right, to commodity spikes in oil and gas imports, and they'll do anything within their control to ensure that those prices remain under control, which of course means cutting any deal that needs to be cut with Russia, because as far as they're concerned, Ukraine is not their war. So I'm not justifying, or rationalizing, I'm simply explaining why India and other Asian countries, strictly through the lens of energy, to say nothing of the fact that they are entitled to their own diplomatic strategies and views and have, not a whole lot of trust in us or necessarily anyone else for that matter. But there are many reasons why you're seeing a broader set of Asian countries saying, we're going to sit this one out, and we welcome Russia quietly, and they'll do whatever it takes to evade sanctions and avoid secondary sanctions and so forth. But Russia really, has become more and more. I've documented this looking back at the last 15 years, 10 years, 5 years. Each snapshot of Russia's economic relationships with China, with India, with Southeast Asia, even in other economies, shows a steady increase in those in those kinds of dyads of trade. So it's broader than just China. It really is a broader Asian kind of constellation. Again, you can see it in the infrastructure map that I showed earlier as well.
It's a great question to ask, and then we observe what's happening on the ground in terms of China policy. At the end of the day, if it's not a healthy economy and its people are not well cared for or happy, we're going to have political problems and instability, and that's very clear. Great question from the audience as well. And so, how will global companies navigate this potentially? How to respond to skilled workforce needs wherever they are, and it could be very different experiences. Will companies migrate to more direct skilling and education versus traditional universities? It's a very interesting question. It exposes a lot of the controversy that exists right now in terms of the debate about higher education, the cost of it.
Yeah, so I think certainly it's a combination of all of the above, and I would add to that higher compensation, which companies have been doing in the past year, although the higher compensation has generally not been keeping pace with inflation, because many prices are reset with much greater frequency than wage contracts are renegotiated. But it has been something that a lot of firms have been having to do to retain a lot of this younger talent. I was actually just a couple weeks ago speaking with the CEO, the CFO, CPO, Chief Procurement Officer of one of the biggest truck leasing companies in the United States, who also happens to run the monthly ISM, Institute for Supply Management Manufacturing Survey. And he was saying that they were really having to increase their average hourly wages because they'd had all these early retirements, and the younger workers had higher rates of absenteeism. They would start the job, then maybe move on to another job, and there are large training costs associated with that sort of turnover. And so higher compensation is going to be part of that. And then, yes, I think we have seen a modestly declining rate of return on higher education. I think we are starting to see some innovation in higher ed, both the founding of new institutions of higher education, and then also firms that are dissatisfied with the output of the traditional higher education sector starting to take on more of the burden of in-house on-the-job training and sort of other types of non-traditional programming.
Parag, you'll know this. In Vietnam, one of the youngest demographic nations in the world, a young workforce raised by access to the internet despite a communist country and environment. And they had the freedom to explore what the internet was like and created their own developer language and had that access self-taught. This is one of the most technologically educated younger workforces in the world. And you take a look at what university structure or higher education was, it was many cases DIY and also opportunity because of the emerging market desires of that country to grow domestically and globally. There's just always two paths. There's always two paths. So what is that path for the future then?
Well, I think that there's a distinction between, I think, what is leading or frontier sectors and sectors that continue to comprise most of the, certainly, American economy. So what I was talking about just a moment ago was labor in transportation and warehousing. And yes, you have some leading sectors, some frontier sectors, where I think that there's enormous scope for continued innovation and disruption. And certainly it's possible that there are huge productivity gains to be had from the proof of concept of Zoom, such that there are tens of millions of young people, not only in advanced economies, but in emerging economies as well, who are just waiting to be discovered by Zoom. But in terms of the vast bulk of the labor market, I think that they're going to be less impacted by a lot of this frontier stuff, and that's why I think we're going to see even if we get productivity improvements at the frontier, I see a lot of structural inflationary pressure moving forward.
Yeah, different.
Could I jump in, Angie? Because you gave that example from Vietnam, and I thought that was it's a really important anecdote that illustrates that digital education is one of the major hockey stick, verticals that is being realized already. Just look at Byju's and companies like that of India. There are private equity or tech conglomerates in Korea and Malaysia and elsewhere that are massively expanding into Southeast Asia in the vernacular languages, offering these skills training at the sort of vocational skills training on the job, what you call direct, again, education within the supply chain, if you will, by companies, integrating those into the worker training so that you reduce in some ways the cost of the onboarding of labor, of young labor, especially given how fickle it is, as Tyler rightly pointed out. So the digitization of that training and those modules and so forth across a wide range of sectors. It could be construction work, it could be hospitality, even nursing and so forth. All of this is now being done on these digital platforms. You take a quick crash course in these areas. It's reproducible for free, of course, and you're pumping those out through people's mobile phones and iPads and tablets and so on. And that's happening all across Asia. And I think that's an example of a combination of all of these things, both the technology and the companies saying we need skills now. We can't wait for the formal educational system, which is rather decrepit in any number of these countries, to do it. And we need, again, low-cost tech platforms to deliver it. So that marriage is happening right now. It's a huge growth sector, quite frankly, all over the world. But you definitely see it as one of the big, big, big growth areas in Asia.
And so it's just that open mindset. Tyler, if we are moving toward a more multipolar world, what are the lessons from the interwar years and the post-war UK experience? And bringing in the central bank, does diversification of central bank reserves result in a weaker dollar and higher borrowing costs for US debt issuers, which speaks to one of the pillars of what you say is necessary for growth, which is capitalization?
Yeah. Sure, and just briefly on the previous question, an anecdote, because I am a technological optimist. At the same time, I have an inner pessimist. And the inner pessimist is informed by an anecdote, again from the transportation and warehousing sector, which was that one key challenge to inventory management in 2021, as we were facing all these supply shortages and a 240% annualized rate of growth in demand for goods in the United States in the month of March 2021 alone, because they couldn't go in person to the warehouses, to the shop floor, and follow these traditional rules of thumbs and heuristics, actually mattered a lot. Sorry, just had to slip in that anecdote. In terms of lessons from the interwar period, the optimist in me says, I don't see the kind of deglobalization that we observed in the 1930s, certainly. Deglobalization in the 1930s was such that we saw the emergence of big, big price differentials between identical commodities across market jurisdictions. Okay, that is deglobalization, when you see those big price differentials. What I do see is the possibility, first, of an increasing frequency and severity of contractions. When you look over the broad sweep of history, one really interesting thing is that periods of high growth are not necessarily characterized by increases in the rate of growth, but rather decreases in the frequency and severity of episodes of recession. And certainly in the first half of the 20th century, we saw a lot of episodes of shrinking, and actually some pretty big shrinks. A lesson from Britain in the post-war period, yes, I don't see the US dollar losing status the way sterling did in the aftermath of 1945. But if we are in a situation in which the US dollar as a fraction of reserve currencies went from 70% a few decades ago, it's at 59% today, that might go down to 50%. What that means is that there's going to be less demand by global central banks for US dollars and US dollar assets. One reason that we, over the past however many decades, have been able to consume well beyond our means in the United States is that we pay such low interest rates on our borrowing from the rest of the world because they have to buy US treasuries.
We are the least dirty shirt in the hamper.
We are the least dirty shirt in the hamper. But if that starts to change, and if we're no longer earning such a premium on our overseas assets relative to the interest we're paying on our debt owed to foreigners, we're either going to have to reduce our consumption, or we're going to have to start paying much higher interest rates in order to attract foreign capital, or some combination of the two. That was the situation that Britain found itself in the aftermath of 1945, was that to fund their imports and to roll over their debt, they often had to jack up interest rates in order to keep capital in the United Kingdom. So that would be my worry, is not quite a full repeat or replay of the experience of Great Britain in the aftermath of 1945. I don't see US dollar crises the way we had recurring sterling crises in the 1940s and 1950s. But that sort of pressure is a dynamic that I think we could observe again.
But there's a dark horse kind of emerging, and it's space that I cover, not necessarily dark, but in my view also very optimistic, because it's creating a parallel complementary system that the world can participate in. That's cryptocurrencies and stable coins and central bank-backed digital currencies. The efforts being made in China since 2014, light years ahead, ready to roll out their ECNY, versus America still talking about whether or not it wants to engage in a digital dollar. At the end of the day, could there be, to your point, this new system that you don't need the US dollar as a global hegemony or as a global reserve, that by default technology or advancements in CBDC allows for the internationalization, whatever that word means to China, with its trading partners through ECNY.
Right, so certainly I still don't see the renminbi as a plausible rival to the US dollar or the US dollar ecosystem, because all of the defects in the renminbi as a global reserve currency that existed before the events of the macroeconomic developments of the past 2 years exist still, and actually are even more problematic than they were before. China in the 2000s was desperate to prevent capital inflows because they didn't want the RMB to appreciate. Now China is desperate to prevent net capital outflows because they actually want a stronger renminbi in order to tap on the brakes of inflationary pressures. So if I'm looking for a global reserve currency, I don't want it to be one with outbound capital controls. And secondly, there's still an insufficient supply of safe Chinese assets, safe and transparent Chinese assets with a deep and liquid market to absorb global demand for reserve currency assets. So I don't see RMB as a credible rival to the US dollar. However, to your point, I do see just increasing diversification. We've seen it over the past couple of decades with the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar. We might have some crypto assets enter that space. Because, look at over the past 2 months, if you talk to Ken Rogoff, former chief economist of the IMF, he said, well, the US government and other advanced economy governments basically just defaulted on their debt by freezing Russia's foreign exchange reserves. So whatever your allocation of global reserves was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you're probably going to want to diversify a little bit, even if it's hard to hide from the dollar. A little bit more of an allocation to AUD or South Korean won or whatever, anything other than the dollar is probably going to be a consideration of many central banks.
It is such an interconnected world. Both of you reflect that whether or not we realize it or not, at the end of the day, we are all affected by these new realities. One sentence takeaway for our global leaders in this crowd, one thing that they should be thinking about.
The 1970s.
There you go. Parag, one
It's not an either.
thing.
Yeah, my final word might be it's not an either or world, right? And I think that our broad, rich conversation reflects it's not U.S. or China, it's not dollar or RMB, right? Not East or West. As you say, we remain interconnected, and there's going to be a lot of different kinds of opportunities everywhere. Part of, just to build on Tyler's final point, the capital inflows in the United States can certainly be reinforced by way of not only the renaissance in the American economy, the manufacturing sector, through our advancements in technology, again, openness of the capital markets, but immigration as well. This is the final point I just wanted to make to end on, is that just speaking with a congressional delegation the other day, it could well be that the United States welcomes 1 million new immigrants this year, 1 million, after a couple of years where it had fallen to 200,000. No country in the world goes from dropping to 200,000 net immigrants in a year up to 1 million. Only America can do that. Only America will do that. And I think that's a source of strength that's very promising. So let's focus on human capital, right? Raising productivity in the ways that Tyler outlined, and then we could, have a win-win future.
Parag Khanna, Tyler Goodspeed. Thanks so much. That was great. That was great. Thanks, Parag. Thanks for joining us. Yep. Thank you. We are so interconnected, aren't we? Many of us have been traveling from home via Zoom, via the metaverse, via whatever technology connects us. So as I send you off, a little housekeeping, the lanyard around your neck, it is technologically interconnected to this environment and experience. When it flashes yellow, it's telling you as a group that we are going to move together to our next session or event. When it flashes purple, it's going to tell you, oh, it's pod time, so you know where you need to go because it's in your program on your app. And then if you are participating in a masterclass, it will flash orange. So kind of cool. How many of you are wearing your immersion? How did you feel? Are you monitoring your feelings? We're monitoring it for you. And by the way, it is completely anonymous, and I do want to let you know, if you don't want to wear it, you do not have to. It's a fun way to immerse ourselves and to track. And you have that QR code that actually tracks it for you. So that's kind of fun. So various things to do during lunch. Eat. That's a good one. How many of you had a big breakfast? Big breakfast, anybody? You guys are like, okay, good. I like that. Always start with yeah, I love it. But Michelin-starred chef, cooking up some good, authentic, with a twist, Chicago treats for you. Make sure you do that. But also, the bakery, where we break bread. And isn't that what we do best? When we find connections and relationships over a common goal of finding ourselves, trying to give ourselves sustenance. So we're going to feed you, but your job is to give your soul and your brain and your inspiration spirit animal a little sustenance as well. Sprinkle a little magic. Food is just one part of that recipe. The rest is up to you. Please go find people you haven't talked to, maybe people outside your industry. It's informative, as Parag and Tyler both were really clear on. This is an interconnected world, not only geographically, but also across experiences, age groups, and all the rest. If you've not scheduled yet, go to the app, schedule a transformation zone conversation, the startup space, those teams in startup land, coming up with scrappy ideas. I can tell you scrappiness is part of the recipe, and attitude and perspective. Have them share that, schedule some interesting conversation. They would be so excited to meet so many of you, get your experience, mentor them as they mentor you in that way. Schedule meetings with our sponsors, some fantastic sponsors here because they're here to support you. Experience the EY-verse, visit the sponsor zones, and if we weren't creating more value enough, CPE, when you exit, you'll see QR codes. And yes, the time that you share with us here should be going and giving you credit. So go ahead and QR code that and register some of your sessions because they actually do give you CPE credits, and you're going to do that after sessions, after your pod, and if there is a credit for your continuing education, there it is. You get credit for that. And all you have to do is use your device to scan the code as you exit the session. So I've talked enough. I think my stomach is talking more for me right now. So please do enjoy. I hope that that really set the tone for your next conversations over lunch. And we'll see you here at the masterclass and at your workshops. Bye, folks.